Heart families. Here's just a little painting inspired by our local lake. Here's what I did. This one is on watercolor paper. I just cut the paper in half. I was using scrap paper to help me work out the idea. And then this one, I really like working in a very small format because the lake scene is more horizontal, and so I took that full piece of watercolor paper, cut it in half. I liked this okay, but I really prefer it in this really small format. So this was cut, so half of it was cut into thirds. And so it's a nice, again, it was a scrap paper as I worked out the idea. So let's get started. I'm using just a regular tray of watercolors. I have a little palette where I can mix colors. You can see usually I mix it in the lid of my paint, but I thought I'd be a little more civilized and use a paint palette if I needed it. I'll scoot it out of my way for now. Need a towel to dry my brush, fresh clear water. And this particular technique, it takes time because I start with wet on wet, and I just keep I add certain pigments, and then I just keep adding to the composition as the paper dries, and the very final steps, the paper has to be completely dry. So this will be more of a time-lapse project in terms of watching it. It could take you even a couple of hours just to make sure, although the painting itself goes very quickly, you want to make sure it is completely dry when you do that last step. So it could take a couple hours to make sure it's completely dry. So first step, I'm going to use my wide brush, clean water, and I've got this taped down so I'll have that nice crisp border when it dries. And I'm going to paint the piece of paper with just water and let it soak in for a moment. I've heard, I haven't done it, but I remember years ago visiting a studio of a watercolor painter, and they had really, really thick watercolor paper, and they literally had the paper immersed in water and let the paper really soak up the water. Again, it was thick enough it could stand that, and then they would pull it out of the water and tape it down and use it very, very wet like that, and then kind of let it dry as they worked through their painting. I never tried that. Okay, so I've got it covered in water. I'm gonna let it dry for just a moment. So I was using my watercolor paints earlier today, and sometimes what I'll do, if they've been sitting for a while, I might, if I know what colors I'm gonna use, I might dribble in just a couple drops of the pigment I'm gonna use, and that kind of gets the pigment loosened up a little bit. I'm not going to do that now because all of these colors have the water in it. So if I keep adding water, I'm really going to make a slurry in there, and I don't want to make a slurry. So the first color I'm going to use is this. It's in the 16 pan tray. We have the primaries and the secondaries over here in the Roy G. Biv order. And on the second one, you have the tertiary colors, which are, for example, which are the colors that come between each primary and secondary color. So this one is the blue purple or the blue violet. This one is the blue green. Actually, this one is not the blue green. This is just a turquoisey color. This is more of a commercial popular color. This is the blue green. This is the yellow green. This is the yellow orange, and this one is the red orange. This one is the red violet. So it would go between these two colors that are at the opposite ends of the tray. So I have a little bit of the blue violet on my brush, and I'm going to paint it and focusing on the corners of my paper. And this is called a wet on wet wash. And I kind of start light, and then I get a little bit darker. And you can see how the pigment is like spreading through the fibers of the paper because all of the paper is wet. And I'm going to do a little bit of this at the bottom also. So I'm doing a lake scene, And so these colors would be reflected in the lake, in the water of the lake. And I'm not getting it quite as intense at the bottom. I don't like how that edge is, so I'm gonna clean my brush, just use water, paint over that to soften it a bit. And I'd painted over it lightly with water. With watercolor, it takes experimentation and time to kind of figure out when things get overworked and how to just let the quality of the pigment do its thing. So I'm going to get a little bit of regular blue and mix that, paint that right into these edges. Just trying to get the color a little more intense, the pigment a little more intense. And again, I don't like that right there, so I'm going to use just a clean brush, paint it with a little water to loosen that a little bit. And then down here, just a little bit with the regular blue. Okay. I think I'm going to do a little more. And then here on the edge, clean the pigment out. Just paint with water on the edge. Okay, so I've got the blues on the outside. When I look at it, I can see that more water is pooling like here more than I would like. So I'm gonna clean my brush and just kind of paint that. I could vacuum it up. Heart students, you probably are very familiar with the vacuuming trick, which is you squeeze all the water out and then you touch your pools of water and vacuum it up. So now I'm going to go into, this is going to be a sunset on the lake. So I'm going to go with yellows and yellow orange and the red orange in the center area. And it's because the paper is still damp, that pigment will kind of blend into these blues and the violets and the blues that I have for the sky, but not completely mix in. So relatively clean brush, and I'll start with the yellow orange, and I'm just going to do a line down the center, and I kind of am testing it to see, does it go green or do I maintain that yellow? And it's staying pretty yellow. A little bit of green maybe. Don't want to get too green there. Clean my brush. Now I'm going to go to the orange, and I want to test it in the palette. So now I'm going to do a little bit of orange. A little bit of experimentation because just a matter of seeing how this is going to bleed out. Now my yellow has a lot of green in it from using it last, so I'm going to take my brush, a damp brush, and get the green out of there because I do not want, if you have any colors, the yellow is the worst one like this, but if you have any colors that have gotten other pigments in it, then this is how you can clean it out. Just let it get a little bit damp. You swirl your brush, a clean brush, and get the polluted color out. I'm going to switch over to a medium watercolor brush. Now I'm going to go back to that yellow, and I want to get just a couple areas of more intense yellow because I'm thinking sunset. I'm going to have the sun in this area. It will eventually be hidden by clouds. And so I'm just laying that color down as like a little bit of a foundation of where the sun would be peeking through the clouds. And I think I'll do a little bit of this red orange while this is wet and see how that looks. And I'm even gonna get, I want the sky, you know how at sunset it starts to get really tinged with pink? So I'm gonna go with the red here. Put it in my palette, and I'm gonna get it pretty watered down. The red is really a strong color, and I'm gonna see how this works. Yeah, I'm just barely touching it, and I'm letting it like wick out into the wet paper, and you can see it wicking into the yellow. I'm adding pretty much just water there, just soften it a little bit more. So now I'm actually just painting with water onto the damp paper, and I can't forget to get some of this down into the water. I like the way it looked. I wanted to spread it out. And now I'm gonna go, I don't like this hard edge here, so I'm gonna take a little bit of water and soften that. So the next step I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go into this red violet, put it in my palette. With this, I'm going to establish where the land is going to be. So a lake scene, one way you can recognize that a waterscape is a lake scene versus an ocean scene is by having water on either, or land rather, on either side of your paper. Because if it's the ocean, it would just be wide open, looking out onto the ocean. Or maybe you can see like the edge of a piece of land, but then there's nothing over here because it's the vast ocean. Whereas a lake, you can, if you show that there's land on either side, you can show that it's contained. So since this is really, really wet, I want to just dab this over here where I'm going to put the land. I'm going to see kind of how wet is the paper and what is it going to do. So I'm just establishing where my land is going to be on either side. And it's probably better to have your land either above halfway or below halfway, because if you do it just right across the center of your paper, it's going to divide it in half and be less interesting. So I'm going to, so that's kind of like the top. Well, I guess my sunset is here. We'll just go with it. Now I added a little bit of black to that slurry of the red violet, and I'm going to add just a little bit there, and you can see it really is, so I have to be super, super careful with that. So I'm going to stop there and let this dry a little bit. At this point, if you knew you wanted to have like some salt in your sky, you could do that. I touched that and I don't like the effect of that. You could add a little bit of salt as you let this stage dry, and I'll do that just so you can see what it looks like. So this is just table salt. This is actually what we use at our meals. So I'm gonna just dab a tiny bit in the sky, not a lot. So I'll let this dry. So I let that dry for a little bit. I want to go back into, before it's completely dry, I want to go back into the clouds and get, so the clouds are going to have some like darkness, some purples, some dark oranges in there. So I want to work on that before it gets completely dry. So I have this color in my tray, and I'll make it again, work with that again. I got this red orange and that red violet. While this is damp, I'm going to come in and do a little bit of work with this color. So I'm going to have just some clouds that sort of settle in here, and the clouds are going to be somewhat horizontal. ish. And my hope is for this to soften a little bit, not stay like hard edged. And then I'm gonna go to the purple. I think there's just a tiny bit of black in this, not much. I'm gonna put it down to get some darkness. So I'm paying attention to where I have the yellow, because that's going to be like the area where the sun is centered. And I'm working kind of light as I map this out. It's somewhat experimental. I'm going to put a little bit of this back where the land is. See how it's fading. So I want the color to be a little more intense than I've got it. So here's the red, violet, and I'm going to go to regular purple. Now go back into these colors with this more intense color, more intense pigment, dark pigment. And it doesn't have to be just flat lines, so I'm gonna sort of use my brush to make it a little bunchier in places. And the beautiful thing about working, say, with clouds and a sunset is that it's not an exact science for an artist. It doesn't have to be. One thing I don't like is this edge right here. So I could approach it a couple ways. I could try to use water and blur that out, but I think what I'm going to try is go back to this red and put that on the edge of it, sort of like the light is coming, the light behind it is giving it sort of this orangish glow on the edge. I'm going to go a little bit bigger. That. So I'm paying attention to what the paper is doing, and the pigments are really, really bleeding out. When I look at it from the side, I can see the water on the surface. So it's not terribly dry yet. But I'm going to go a little bit darker with my land and do just a thin line out. And I'm going to go a little bit wider. So this is where my land's going to be. And I'm going to let that dry for a little bit. So I want to see if I can capture, when I look at it from the side, if you see the reflection, you can see just how wet the surface of the paper is. So that's what I need. I need to wait and let it dry a little bit more before I continue. Okay, so I let it dry a little bit longer. I really like how the clouds, this cloud area is, I don't know what the right term is, but the fibers are wicking it and it's really softening the edges. That edge did not soften very much, but I think I'm still going to be able to work with that in a way that's satisfying. I'm gonna see what would happen if I work with just a brush and sort of try to brush up the edge, soften the edge a little bit. So we'll see what that does. So I want to go back and get the clouds a little more solid, a little more grayish and intense. So working with the black in that red violet color. I think it got a little too black. And let's see what it does if I touch here. And so I'm going to use the tip of the brush and then paint outward. Yeah, not much is going down. The tip of the brush. Now this was accidental, where I was trying to, and it just shows you a great effect of how the wet paper fibers, right here, I just love what happened. I may end up painting over it completely, but since I went in and worked with water in this area, it's created this interesting little pattern down where I was painting the land. So I'm gonna see if I can find a way to preserve that as I go. So I'm gonna get a little more aggressive with this dark. I have to be really careful here because it could wick right up into the sky. So I'm gonna pause. So this has dried quite a bit. That beautiful pattern that I had before is totally dissipated, but I do like this, I don't know, almost like fog lifting off of the land kind of effect that I'm getting. So I'm gonna go back into the clouds before it's completely dry. I wanna see if I can get them a little bit darker. And I'm sticking to painting in the center of these cloud shapes because I want the darkness in the center and then the outer edges to be more of that glowing orange. There's a cat hair that settled out on my painting, so I just blew it off. Pushed my brush down to get a little bit thicker in the center. Using just the tip of the brush. Now I'm gonna go to the land again and go get a little, yeah, it's still really wet. Just get a little more on there, a little more pigment. And I need to let it dry. So I've let this dry, about 45 minutes. And when I touch it, there's a coolness to it. So I think there's just still a little bit of dampness in the fibers. But I'm gonna attempt some of the finishing touches. So one thing with the land is all the edges have been very, very, very fuzzy. So now I'm gonna go, I've got the black on my tray, and the land is just gonna be in silhouette against this sunset background. And so I'm gonna kind of, the top edge is just gonna be kind of uneven, like trees, like the tops of trees, a tree line, and the bottom edge, I'm gonna get it smooth and then fill the inside. And the same thing on this side. So then with my brush, I want it to be, this is the smallest brush I got, and I want the point to be just as small as possible. And you could stop at that as far as you get the idea of it being a lake, but I want the effect of our lake. So I'm gonna do the bridge, just a silhouette of the bridge going across. And so it just takes a steady hand. I'm going to do a straight line with the very, very tip of my brush, pretty much just the black paint, connecting the two pieces of land. Once I get that on, I'm going to do a second line, gets it a little bit thicker. And then I'm going to do tiny little vertical lines. And the key with these is just try to space them evenly. And it ends up kind of establishing the proportions for your composition. So now if those, I guess they're called pylons, or the up and down part of the bridge is that size, so what size would a boater be in this composition? And I'm gonna do a tiny little boat, the right proportion. So I'm just gonna paint with the black kind of a rectangular shape, and then above that just a little line. So it'll be like I don't know, it could be a pontoon boat and then a little line, or maybe a deck boat, some kind of a boat with a little bit of like a bit, I don't know, what do you call it, bimini top. I'm gonna let that dry. Now with our lake, we have, with our landscape, we have cell towers, and it looks kind of cool. I'm gonna use, I haven't even put any more paint on my brush, but with that small brush, the black is almost a gray on the brush. I'll do one on this side of the lake and one on this side of the lake, like so. So I'm gonna let that dry and then come back to it and see if there's anything else I wanna add. Let that dry a little bit, and so it gave me a chance to just sort of study my composition, and I'm not crazy with the shape of this cell tower, so I'm gonna come back and add just a little bit over here. Almost the angle just wasn't quite right, so I did it again to get the angle better. Then using just the tip of the brush, I'm gonna do just the lightest gray under the horizontal parts of the bridge. Just kind of get that idea of the water moving. Here under the cell tower, really, really watered down gray. Over here under the boat, I'm gonna get the boat a little bit darker, so that lighter color sort of helped me establish where I wanted. The lighter gray helped me establish where I wanted it. Now I'm gonna just commit a little bit more, and then below it, a little bit of gray. Same here. The water tower is a little bit of gray. Water tower over here. You could even add some horizontal brush strokes in the water. So like this gray could kind of mimic where those gray clouds are. But just really, really soft. In the water, you really want to stick to like horizontal brush strokes. And I'm gonna let that dry. Well, before I stop, I'm gonna go back. I don't like that light space between there and the land. And when you get just some of these little gray, it's getting too dark. These little gray side strokes or horizontal marks, it kind of makes the lighter areas seem to sparkle a little bit. So I think it's very effective that way in adding some variety to the color that's in the water. So I'm satisfied. I'm gonna let that dry complete. No, I know what, after the, no, wait, sorry. This is how my brain works. I wanna go with just the finest line that I can, nice and dark and fine, so into my bridge and get this nice and dark. And what's kind of nice with doing a silhouette is that the details, like how the bridge attaches to the land, it just sort of gets lost in that silhouette effect. And so I don't have to describe that a lot visually. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then I'll come back, see if there's any other finishing details, and I'll be ready to pull the tape off. So I let it dry. There are just a couple things I want to revisit. I don't like the angle of some of these little things here, so I'm going to get them more horizontal. And I can't erase or change them, I'm just adding to them so they're a little more horizontal. So you don't really see the horizon line in this composition, just the sunset disappears into the water, and then having the bridge there really helps so that little effect works. So just since all I did was that little bit, I'm going to go ahead and remove my tape. So this is the big reveal. I can't really like rub it to get all that salt off since that's damp right now. Those little places are damp, but oh no, it bled through. So this is not satisfying right here. What I might try doing is getting a little bit of white paint and touching up those areas so I still have that crisp white border. I'm gonna try it. Okay guys, so this is it. I finished it up. I took a little bit of tempera paint and painted over where the pigment had bled through the tape. I think I need to get different tape because two things are happening. Sometimes it rips the paper and then sometimes it bleeds. So I may need to look into getting different tape. Really like how it turned out, the overall effect. I personally like how the different pigments pool around the edge. It kind of makes it look like an old photograph. It reminds me of a Polaroid, an old Polaroid picture actually. So I wanted to show you kind of some different ones. This is the one that I had finished last night that I showed you when I started. And then this is the first one that I did and just kind of working out the idea. It almost looks like the top of it, like this reminds me more of like Arizona landscape. So I think you could apply the technique to a lot of different landscapes. And then this is the first one, the larger one that I did. I really do like the smaller formats, but that's not bad. It's still kind of interesting. On this one, you can see more so at least in person. I don't know if in the video, but the varieties in the darkness. It really looks like this bridge is in front of that piece of landscape, which makes it kind of interesting. A lot less diffusing on this particular one, whereas these last two I did, the pigments really diffused a lot. So have fun trying this. I look forward to seeing what you guys did.